Good evening, everyone. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you find this analysis valuable, please hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed about the most important developments shaping our world. Your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth analysis you won't find anywhere else. Tonight, what we're witnessing is not just another military update from the front lines. It's a fundamental shift in the nature of this war, a moment that historians may point to as the night when the illusion of Russian invincibility finally cracked wide open. Because when Moscow, the beating heart of Russian power, suddenly goes dark, when air raid sirens wail through streets that haven't heard them in decades, when ordinary Russians scramble for safety in their own capital, something profound has changed. For nearly 3 years, this war has played out like a one-sided nightmare for Ukraine. Russian missiles raining down on apartment buildings, schools turned to rubble, hospitals operating by candlelight, entire cities plunged into freezing darkness during the brutal winter months. The world watched in horror as Putin's forces systematically targeted civilian infrastructure, as if breaking the spirit of ordinary people could somehow win a war. But last night, something remarkable happened. Ukrainian drones, sleek and silent, crossed into Russian airspace and struck at the heart of Moscow's power grid. The result? Massive blackouts across the Russian capital. Emergency services overwhelmed. Government buildings scrambling to back up generators. And for the first time since this war began, ordinary Russians got a small taste of what Ukrainians have endured every single day for nearly 3 years. Think about that for a moment. The nation that has spent years boasting about its military might, that has consistently targeted Ukrainian civilians with impunity, suddenly finds its own capital vulnerable. The country that thought it could wage war without consequence just discovered that actions have consequences, and those consequences can come home in ways you never expected. To understand why this moment matters so much, we need to look at the pattern of Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. It's been brutal and systematic. Let's be clear about what Russia has done. Since the early days of this invasion, Putin's military strategy has focused on one simple, cruel calculation. If you can't defeat the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, try to break the Ukrainian people at home. Make them cold, make them scared, make them desperate, force them to choose between resistance and survival. The numbers tell a devastating story. Over the past 3 years, Russia has launched thousands of missiles and drones specifically targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Power plants destroyed, electrical substations turned to twisted metal, gas pipelines ruptured, water treatment facilities bombed. This wasn't collateral damage. This was the strategy. Remember those images from last winter? Ukrainian families huddled together in subway stations, trying to stay warm. Hospitals performing surgeries by flashlight. Elderly people freezing in their apartments because there was no heat, no electricity, no way to stay warm when temperatures dropped below zero. Children doing homework by candlelight because there was no power for lights. And through it all, Moscow remained bright, untouched, safe. The Kremlin was lit up every night like nothing was happening. Russian citizens went about their lives, largely insulated from the war their government was waging in their name. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Ukraine in darkness, Russia in light. But here's what makes this moment so significant. For months, Ukraine's leadership has been making a simple argument to its Western allies. If Russia can strike our infrastructure, we should be able to strike theirs. If they can target our power plants, we should be able to target military and strategic infrastructure inside Russia. If they want to bring the war to our civilians, they need to understand that war is a two-way street. Western governments were cautious. There were concerns about escalation, about provoking Putin into even more extreme actions, about crossing red lines that might spiral into something worse. But Ukraine persisted. And more importantly, Ukraine developed its own capabilities. Long-range drones that could reach deep into Russian territory, sophisticated targeting systems, the ability to strike back. And that's exactly what they did last night. Here's the hook that makes this so striking. The operation wasn't random. It wasn't revenge. It was surgical, calculated, and deeply symbolic. Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated drone strike targeting electrical infrastructure around Moscow. Not civilian apartments, not hospitals, not schools. They targeted the same kind of infrastructure that Russia has been systematically destroying in Ukraine for years. Power substations, transformers, electrical nodes that keep a modern city running. The drones came in waves, timed to overwhelm Russian air defenses. Some were decoys, designed to draw fire and attention. Others carried real payloads, precision-guided to hit specific targets. Russian air defense systems shot down many of them, but not all. And the ones that got through did exactly what they were designed to do. By midnight Moscow time, large sections of the Russian capital were experiencing rolling blackouts. Traffic lights went dark. The Moscow metro had to switch to emergency power. Government buildings, normally lit up like monuments, suddenly went dark. For several hours, parts of Moscow looked like parts of Ukraine have looked for months. Dark, vulnerable, uncertain. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Ukrainian government's response to this operation was masterful. They didn't gloat. They didn't celebrate. They simply stated facts. Ukrainian officials confirmed that their forces had struck military infrastructure inside Russia. They noted that these were legitimate military targets, and they made one simple point. Russia has been doing this to Ukraine for years. Ukraine is simply defending itself using the same tactics Russia pioneered. That restraint is important. Because what Ukraine demonstrated last night wasn't just military capability, it was strategic thinking. They showed that they understand the difference between revenge and justice, between retaliation and self-defense. They could have targeted civilian areas. They had the capability, but they didn't. They chose to mirror Russia's stated military targets while avoiding the civilian casualties that Russia has consistently inflicted on Ukraine. Think about the message that sends. To the Russian people, it says, your government's actions have consequences. The war your leaders started isn't happening in some distant place anymore. It's here. It's real. And your government can't protect you from it. To the Ukrainian people, it says, we can fight back. We're not helpless victims. We have the capability and the will to defend ourselves, to take this fight to the enemy, to show them that aggression comes with a price. And to the world, it says, the balance of power in this war is shifting. Russia's advantage in long-range strike capabilities is no longer absolute. Ukraine has closed that gap. The playing field is more level than it's ever been. Now, let's be honest about something. Some people are going to say that Ukraine shouldn't be striking inside Russia, that it's escalatory, that it risks making the war worse. And we need to address that argument directly because it matters. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Russia has been escalating this war since day one. The invasion itself was escalation. The targeting of civilians was escalation. The bombing of hospitals, schools, and residential areas was escalation. The systematic destruction of Ukraine's power grid during winter, knowing it would cause suffering and death among civilians, was escalation. But somehow, when Ukraine strikes back at military infrastructure, when they use the same tactics Russia has used for years, suddenly it's Ukraine that's accused of escalation. That's not just wrong, it's morally backwards. Let's talk about the laws of war for a moment. International humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the rules that are supposed to govern armed conflict, they're very clear about one thing. Military infrastructure is a legitimate target. Power stations that supply military installations, transportation networks that move troops and equipment, communication systems that coordinate military operations, these are all legitimate targets in wartime. Russia has been striking these targets in Ukraine since the beginning. But Russia has also been striking purely civilian targets. Apartment buildings, shopping centers, hospitals, schools, playgrounds, places with no military value whatsoever. Places where the only possible purpose of the attack is to terrorize civilians. Ukraine's strike on Moscow was different. Yes, it affected civilians. Blackouts affect everyone in a city. But the targets were infrastructure that has military applications. The intent wasn't to terrorize Russian civilians. It was to degrade Russia's military capabilities and to send a message, if you can strike our infrastructure, we can strike yours. That distinction matters. It's the difference between legitimate military action and terrorism. It's the difference between self-defense and revenge. And it's a distinction that Ukraine has been careful to maintain even as Russia has crossed every moral line imaginable. Here's what makes this even more striking. Ukraine could have chosen different targets. They have the capability to strike civilian areas in Moscow. They could have targeted residential buildings, shopping centers, places where Russian civilians gather, but they didn't. Even after years of watching Russian missiles strike Ukrainian civilians, even after seeing their own people suffer through targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, Ukraine chose restraint. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's moral clarity. That's Ukraine saying, we will fight back, we will defend ourselves, but we will not become the thing we're fighting against. We will not abandon our values, even when fighting an enemy that abandoned theirs long ago. But beyond the military and moral dimensions, there's something deeply symbolic about what happened in Moscow last night, something that goes to the heart of this entire conflict. For nearly 3 years, the Kremlin has tried to control the narrative of this war. In Russia, state media has portrayed the invasion as a limited, special military operation. They've told Russian citizens that everything is going according to plan, that Russia is strong and Ukraine is weak, that the West is failing and Russia is winning. They've tried to maintain the illusion that this war is happening over there, in Ukraine, and that ordinary Russians don't need to worry about it. Moscow going dark shattered that illusion in the most visceral way possible. You can spin a battlefield loss, you can explain away a military setback, but you can't spin a blackout. When the lights go out in your apartment, when the traffic signals stop working, when you have to use your phone's flashlight to navigate your own home, that's real, that's immediate, that's undeniable. For the first time since this war began, significant numbers of ordinary Russians experienced what Ukrainians have been living with for years. Not the full horror of it, not the sustained, systematic destruction that Ukraine has endured, but a glimpse, a taste, a moment of vulnerability that makes you realize this war isn't as distant as your government told you it was. And that's powerful. Because once people start feeling the war personally, they start asking questions. Why is this happening? Why are we at war? What are we fighting for? Is it worth this? These are dangerous questions for an authoritarian regime that has built its legitimacy on the promise of stability and strength. There's also a deeper symbolism in the choice of target. Power, electricity, light. These aren't just practical necessities in a modern city. They're symbols of civilization, of progress, of control. When you can keep the lights on, it signals that your government is competent, that your society is functioning, that everything is under control. When the lights go out, all of that is called into question. Suddenly, the government that promised to protect you seems vulnerable. The military that's supposed to keep you safe couldn't keep the power on. The strength that was supposed to be Russia's defining characteristic looks a lot more like weakness. Ukraine understood this. That's why the operation was so effective. It wasn't about causing maximum damage or maximum casualties. It was about causing maximum psychological impact. It was about forcing Russian citizens to confront an uncomfortable reality. Your government started a war, and that war is coming home. In many ways, this is political warfare at its finest. Not in the sense of dirty tricks or propaganda, but in the sense of using military action to achieve political and psychological objectives. Ukraine didn't just strike Moscow's infrastructure. They struck at the Kremlin's narrative of control and invincibility. And here's where the irony becomes almost poetic. For months, Russian state media has been broadcasting images of Ukrainian cities in darkness. They've shown destroyed power plants, blackened buildings, people living without electricity. And they've presented these images not as evidence of Russian brutality, but as proof of Russian power. Look what we can do. Look how we can make them suffer. But last night, when Moscow went dark, Russian state media couldn't show those images. They couldn't broadcast footage of darkened Moscow streets, of confused citizens, of a vulnerable capital, because those images would undermine everything the Kremlin has been telling the Russian people. They would prove that Russia isn't as powerful as claimed, that Russian air defenses aren't impenetrable, that the war Moscow started can't be contained within Ukraine's borders. So instead, we got silence. Russian state media barely mentioned the blackouts. They downplayed the drone strikes. They insisted that air defenses had performed perfectly, even as parts of Moscow sat in darkness. They tried to maintain the illusion of control, even as the reality of vulnerability became impossible to ignore. But here's the thing about darkness. It's hard to hide. People know when their power goes out. They know when the lights don't work. They know when they have to light candles and wonder what's happening. And when their lived experience contradicts what their government is telling them, that creates doubt. And doubt in an authoritarian system is dangerous. What makes this even more significant is the timing. Russia has been intensifying its attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure in recent months, trying to make this winter as brutal as possible for Ukrainian civilians. They've been systematically targeting power plants and electrical substations, clearly hoping to break Ukrainian morale before another freezing winter sets in. And then Ukraine strikes back. Not randomly, but precisely. Not mindlessly, but strategically. They've essentially told Russia, if you want to fight a war of infrastructure destruction, we can play that game too. And maybe, just maybe, if your own cities start going dark, you'll reconsider whether this strategy is really worth it. That's not just military tactics. That's deterrence. It's Ukraine trying to change Russia's strategic calculation by making the consequences of continued infrastructure attacks unacceptable. It's a high-stakes gamble, but it might be the only way to get Russia to stop targeting Ukrainian civilians. And this brings us to something bigger than tactics or strategy. Something that goes to the heart of why this war matters, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us. What we're witnessing in Ukraine is a fundamental test of whether freedom can defend itself against aggression, whether a democratic society, for all its messy debates and competing voices, can summon the unity and strength needed to resist an authoritarian power determined to destroy it. And Ukraine is passing that test. Not perfectly, not without tremendous cost, but they're passing it. They're showing that free people, fighting for their homes and their future, can stand up to tanks and missiles and overwhelming military force. They're proving that democracy, when pushed to the brink, can fight back. Last night's operation in Moscow is part of that larger story. It's Ukraine saying, we are not victims waiting for rescue. We are not helpless civilians hoping someone else will save us. We are a nation that will defend itself with everything we have. We will innovate, we will adapt, and we will find ways to strike back at those who attack us. That matters beyond Ukraine's borders, because there are other authoritarian powers watching this war very closely. They're watching to see if aggression pays. They're watching to see if a powerful country can simply take what it wants from a smaller neighbor. They're watching to see if the international order that has maintained relative peace for decades will hold or crumble. Ukraine's resistance and operations like last night's strike on Moscow send a clear message to those watching powers. Aggression has costs. Invasion isn't easy. Free people will fight back, and they'll find ways to make you pay for attacking them. The world order isn't dead yet. And there's something else worth noting. Ukraine is fighting this war largely with weapons and equipment provided by Western allies. But the innovation, the strategy, the tactics, that's all Ukraine. The West provided tools. Ukraine is providing the intelligence, the courage, and the strategic thinking that's making those tools effective. Last night's drone operation is a perfect example. These were Ukrainian-designed drones, built with Ukrainian ingenuity, operated by Ukrainian forces, guided by Ukrainian intelligence. The operation was conceived, planned, and executed by Ukraine. They're not just defending their country. They're doing it on their own terms, with their own capabilities. So what does all of this mean? Where do we go from here? First, it means that this war has entered a new phase. The days when Russia could strike Ukraine with impunity while keeping its own territory safe are over. Ukraine now has the capability to reach deep into Russia, to strike strategic targets, to make the war real for Russians in a way it hasn't been before. That changes the strategic calculation for both sides. Second, it means that Ukraine is not going to be intimidated into submission. After nearly 3 years of brutal warfare, after tens of thousands of casualties, after seeing their cities destroyed and their people displaced, Ukrainians are still fighting, still innovating, still finding ways to resist. That resilience, that determination, it's remarkable, and it's something that Russia fundamentally miscalculated when they launched this invasion. Third, it means that the moral dimension of this conflict remains clear. Ukraine continues to fight with restraint even as they gain new capabilities. They could have turned last night's operation into a massacre. They chose not to. They maintain a moral distinction between legitimate military targets and civilian terror that Russia abandoned long ago. And that matters. In war, how you fight says as much as why you fight. Looking ahead, we can expect Russia to respond. They always do. There will likely be more. Strikes on Ukrainian cities, more attempts to terrorize civilians, more brutal tactics designed to break Ukrainian morale. But here's what Russia needs to understand. Those tactics haven't worked for 3 years. They're not going to work now. Every missile Russia launches at Ukrainian civilians just strengthens Ukrainian resolve. Every war crime just deepens international support for Ukraine. Every brutal attack just proves why Ukraine is fighting in the first place. And now, Ukraine has shown it can strike back. Not just defend, but attack. Not just absorb punishment, but deliver it. That's a game changer. Because the only thing that might actually make Russia reconsider its strategy is the realization that this war has costs for Russia too. That Moscow can go dark, just like Kyiv. That Russian infrastructure can be destroyed, just like Ukrainian infrastructure. That the war Putin started can't be contained within the borders he tried to redraw. The lights that went out in Moscow last night illuminated a simple truth that the Kremlin has tried to hide. Russia is not invincible. Its air defenses can be penetrated. Its cities can be struck. Its people can feel vulnerable. The myth of overwhelming Russian power is exactly that, a myth. And Ukraine just helped expose it. For Ukrainians living through another day of this war, last night's operation was more than just a military success. It was proof that they can fight back effectively, that they're not helpless, that their military can protect them by taking the fight to the enemy. In a war where morale is everything, where the will to keep fighting determines outcomes as much as weapons and tactics, that kind of proof matters enormously. And for the rest of us watching this conflict unfold, last night should remind us why Ukraine's fight matters. This isn't just about one country's sovereignty. It's about whether we live in a world where might makes right, where powerful countries can simply take what they want from weaker neighbors. It's about whether the international order will hold or collapse. It's about whether democracy can defend itself against authoritarianism. Ukraine is on the front lines of that larger struggle. They're fighting for their own freedom, yes. But in doing so, they're also fighting for principles that affect all of us. The principle that borders matter, that sovereignty matters, that international law matters, that aggression should have consequences. Last night, when Ukrainian drones struck Moscow and plunged parts of the Russian capital into darkness, they didn't just demonstrate military capability. They demonstrated something more fundamental: the power of a free people fighting for their survival. The creativity and determination of a nation that refuses to surrender. The resilience of a democracy under siege. Russia wanted to break Ukraine. Instead, Ukraine is showing the world what it means to be unbreakable. Russia wanted to demonstrate its power. Instead, Ukraine is exposing its weakness. Russia wanted this to be a quick, easy war. Instead, it's becoming a long, costly, losing struggle against people who will never stop fighting for their freedom. The lights in Moscow may be back on by now, but the truth that was revealed when they went dark, that can't be turned off. Russia is vulnerable. Ukraine can strike back. This war has consequences for the aggressor, not just the victim. And the balance of power in this conflict is shifting in ways that Putin never anticipated. That's where we are tonight. A war that Russia thought it would win in days has dragged on for years. A nation Russia thought it would quickly conquer has become one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world. And a city that thought itself untouchable has learned that in modern warfare, nowhere is truly safe. The darkness that briefly fell over Moscow last night was more than just a power outage. It was a message. It was a warning. And it was a reminder that in any conflict, actions have consequences. Russia brought this war to Ukraine. Now Ukraine is bringing it back to Russia. And the Kremlin, for all its bluster and threats, is learning that some battles can't be won, some nations can't be conquered, and some people will never stop fighting for their freedom. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue to follow this story and provide the in-depth analysis you need to understand what's really happening in this conflict. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, the truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable. Good night.